Harlem, 1963. Three of the most dangerous men in New York spent 3 weeks building the perfect plan to end Bumpy Johnson at midnight, and by 11:59 the plan was still perfect. But Bumpy never moved, never called for help, never changed a single thing about his night. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made 3 killers destroy each other before they ever reached his door? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. Harlem, New York, Tuesday night, November 12th, 1963, 10 o'clock. The restaurant on 116th Street had been closed to the public since 8. The sign on the door said, "Private event, no entry." The cook had been sent home early with a full week's pay and instructions not to ask questions. The waitstaff had been dismissed at 7:30. By 9:15, the only people left in the building were the 3 men who had arranged this meeting. The 2 armed men standing at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement, and the particular darkness that settles over a room where something irreversible is being decided. The basement itself was not remarkable. Concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling on a short chain, a wooden table, square, big enough for 4 but set for 3. And on that table, spread flat with its corners weighted down by a coffee mug, an ashtray, and 2 empty glasses, was a map of Harlem. Not a tourist map, not the kind sold at newsstands downtown. This was a working map, hand-annotated in 3 different colors of ink, with specific addresses circled, specific blocks marked, specific routes traced in red from 3 separate starting points to a single destination on the corner of Edgecombe Avenue and 145th Street. The 3 men sitting around that map were not drinking. They were not talking. They were doing what men do in the final hours before something cannot be undone. They were checking. Going over the plan one more time, not because there was anything left to fix, but because checking was the only way to manage the particular tension that comes from knowing that in exactly 2 hours, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson would be dead. That was the plan, the most carefully constructed plan anyone had ever assembled to bring down one man in Harlem. And to understand why 3 men who had never fully trusted each other were sitting in a basement on 116th Street at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you have to understand who those 3 men were, what they each wanted, and what they were each willing to do to get it. Carlo Messina was 41 years old, born in Palermo, raised in Brooklyn, and employed for the past 19 years by an organization downtown that did not advertise its existence and did not appreciate being discussed in public. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing in any way that would draw attention in a crowd. He had the kind of face that witnesses struggled to describe afterward regular features. Careful eyes, a mouth that moved as little as possible when he spoke. He wore a gray suit that had been pressed that morning. His shoes were clean. His hands were still. Messina had been sent to Harlem 3 months ago with a specific mandate clear the way for his organization's expansion into the numbers operations above 110th Street. Harlem represented approximately $4 million annually in policy revenue, conservatively estimated. His organization wanted that revenue. They had wanted it for years. What had stopped them, consistently, was not the logistics of running numbers in a black neighborhood, and it was not the police, who could be managed. What had stopped them was one man who had spent 18 years building something in Harlem that was less like a criminal operation and more like a second government, something embedded so deeply in the neighborhood's trust and daily life that removing it required removing him first. Messina understood this with the cold clarity of a professional. He did not hate Bumpy Johnson. He did not fear him in the way that weaker men feared him. He simply recognized that Johnson was an obstacle, and that obstacles, in Messina's experience, were removed through planning, precision, and the kind of patience that most people in their business lacked entirely. He had studied Johnson for 11 weeks before agreeing to this arrangement. He had mapped Johnson's routines, his relationships, his vulnerabilities, and then he had sat down with the 2 men now seated across from him and explained, with the same tone a contractor might use to describe a renovation schedule, exactly how this would be done, What Messina had not explained, what he had no intention of explaining, was what would happen to Ray Doyle and Preacher Willis after midnight. That was a separate calculation, a tidier ending to a messy collaboration. And Messina was, above all things, a man who preferred tidy endings. Ray Doyle was 34, and he was afraid. Not of tonight. Specifically, he had told himself enough times that tonight was clean. Tonight was controlled. Tonight was the end of something that needed ending. But afraid, in the deeper way that a man is afraid, when he has crossed a line he cannot uncross and lives every day with the knowledge of what he left behind on the other side. Doyle had worked for Bumpy Johnson for 6 years. 6 years of standing close enough to see how the man thought, how he moved through rooms, how he made decisions, how he read people with a precision that still made Doyle uncomfortable to remember. He had left Johnson's organization 14 months ago. The official story, the story he told himself, was ambition. That Johnson had held him back, that there was a ceiling in Johnson's world that Doyle was too large to fit under. The real story was simpler and less flattering. Messina's organization had offered him money and a future, and Doyle had taken it. He had not thought carefully enough about what that decision would eventually require of him. And now he was sitting in a basement at 10 o'clock at night, looking at a map of a neighborhood he had walked every day for 6 years, and contributing the one thing he uniquely had to offer: the knowledge of exactly where Bumpy Johnson would be at midnight, and exactly why he would not expect what was coming. Doyle's hands were flat on the table. He kept them flat deliberately. He did not want Messina to see them move. Preacher Willis was not his real name. Nobody who worked with Willis knew his real name, and the few people who had tried to find out had discovered that the effort came with consequences they had not anticipated. Willis was 47, from Baltimore originally, and had been working in the specific profession of being hired to resolve problems that other men lacked the nerve to resolve themselves for the better part of 2 decades. He had done this kind of work in 9 cities. He had never been arrested. He had never been identified. He had a face like a deacon at a Sunday service open. Calm, faintly sorrowful, which was where the name had come from. Years ago, in circumstances nobody present tonight needed to know about. Willis had been paid half his fee on the day the arrangement was made. He would receive the other half when the work was confirmed complete. This was standard. What was not standard, what Willis had noticed within the first hour of meeting Messina and Doyle, and filed away with the careful attention of a man whose survival depended on noticing things early, was the particular way Messina looked at Doyle when Doyle was not looking back. Not with the casual contempt Messina showed toward everyone. With something more specific. Something that Willis recognized as the expression of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. Willis had taken note of this. He had said nothing. He had accepted his half payment, studied the map, confirmed the logistics, and arrived tonight carrying 2 things. Nobody in this basement knew about a second weapon strapped to his left ankle, and a private contingency for what he would do if the situation after midnight became different from the situation as described. 3 men, 1 plan, 1 map, 1 destination, and in 2 hours, the most dangerous man in Harlem would be dead. That was what they believed at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, November 12th, 1963. That was what the map told them. That was what the plan, detailed and cross-checked and built on 3 weeks of surveillance, confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, sitting in that basement, staring at that map, was that the most dangerous intelligence in the room was not in the plan on the table. It was in the particular silence that had settled between them. The silence of 3 men who each believed they were the only one in the room keeping a secret. 3 weeks earlier, those same 3 men had spent 4 days following Bumpy Johnson through Harlem with the methodical patience of men who understood that surveillance, done correctly, is not exciting. It is repetitive. It is cold. It involves standing on the same corner for 3 hours watching a man buy a newspaper, eat breakfast, talk to people he has known for 20 years, and then walk 12 blocks north to do the same thing again. What they had documented in those 4 days was comprehensive. Johnson left his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue between 7:15 and 7:45 every morning. He ate breakfast at the same diner on 145th Street 4 days out of 5. He visited 3 specific addresses: a barber shop, a social club, and a numbers bank in roughly the same order each afternoon. He returned home between 9:30 and 10:15 in the evening. He had, as far as surveillance could determine, reduced his visible security to a minimum in recent weeks. No standing guard at the apartment door, no regular escort on his daily walks. Either Johnson had grown careless, or he had grown confident. The plan assumed careless. The plan was built on that assumption. On Tuesday night, specifically, Messina had confirmed this across 3 consecutive Tuesdays. Johnson returned to his apartment alone, bought a newspaper from the stand on the corner of Edgecombe and 145th Dar, and was inside his building no later than 10 o'clock. He did not leave again until morning. The building's service entrance on the side street was accessible. The hallway on Johnson's floor was unguarded. The window in the stairwell provided a sight line to his apartment door. Every detail had been checked. Every route had been walked. Every timing had been confirmed. The plan had no visible flaws. Messina had said this on 3 separate occasions in the past week, each time with the particular satisfaction of a man who takes pride in his work. The plan has no visible flaws. 3 weeks of preparation, 3 men with specific roles, 1 target with his guard down. At 11:45, Messina would take the service entrance. Doyle, who still had a key, from a time before his departure from Johnson's organization, a key Johnson did not know he had kept, would handle the interior approach. Willis would cover the exterior, the corner, the only route of exit that the building's layout made practical. It was, by any professional measure, a sound plan. The kind of plan that succeeds on paper. Bumpy Johnson had no reason to know it existed. Across Harlem, at that same moment, in an apartment on the 4th floor of a brownstone 3 blocks from where the 3 men sat studying their map. A lamp was on in a window. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting in a wooden chair by that window, and he was reading The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky. He was on page 340, a passage he had read before, about the nature of guilt and the stories men tell themselves to make their choices bearable. A cup of coffee sat on the small table beside him, still warm. The apartment was quiet. The door was unlocked, which was unusual only to people who did not understand that Bumpy Johnson had long ago stopped relying on locks. There was no one else in the apartment, no guard at the door, no associate waiting in the kitchen, no weapon visible on any surface in the room. To anyone looking through that window from the street below, and several people had looked, over the past 3 weeks, though Johnson had said nothing about noticing them, the scene was unremarkable. An old man reading a book alone at night. This was, in its way, the most precisely calculated thing Bumpy Johnson had done in months, because Bumpy Johnson had not spent 18 years surviving in Harlem by being careless. And he had not survived by being lucky. Though luck had occasionally played a role in the early years when he was still learning, he had survived by understanding with a depth and consistency that most people in his world could not match the difference between what a situation appeared to be and what it actually was, between what a man said he wanted and what he was actually reaching for, between the plan as described and the plan as intended. He had learned this the hard way, in the years before his first incarceration, when he was young enough to still be surprised by betrayal. He had been surprised exactly twice. After the second time, he had made a decision that governed everything that followed. He would never again walk into a room without already knowing what the room contained. 18 years in Harlem had sharpened this into something that people who witnessed it sometimes described, afterward, as an almost supernatural quality, an ability to read situations before they fully materialized, a sense for the architecture of other people's intentions. Johnson himself, when the subject came up, which was rarely, because he did not encourage discussions about how his mind worked, described it differently. He said that Harlem was a living thing, that it breathed, that it had a particular rhythm to it, a texture of sound and movement and social interaction that was consistent enough, when you had paid attention to it for long enough, that any deviation from that rhythm became immediately audible. The way a musician hears a wrong note in a piece he has played 1,000 times. He had been hearing wrong notes for 11 days. It had started with something small. A man he had known for 6 years, a runner named Eddie. Reliable, consistent, always at his usual corner. By 8 in the morning, had not been at his corner on a Monday. Had not been there Tuesday either. When Johnson mentioned this to someone who would know, he was told Eddie had taken a few days off. Family matter. Nothing significant. This was plausible. Johnson had filed it without conclusion. Then a conversation had stopped. Not rudely, nothing so obvious. But Johnson had walked into the barber shop on a Wednesday afternoon, and the two men talking near the window had shifted, almost imperceptibly, into a different register. The conversation had not ended, but it had changed. The way a conversation changes when the subject of the conversation walks into the room. Then a face he did not recognize had appeared on the corner of 145th 3 days in a row. Not a face that did anything threatening. Not a face that lingered, obviously. Just a face that was there. Consistently. At the times Johnson was most reliably in that part of the neighborhood. A face that looked at Johnson the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize. Johnson had noticed all of this. He had said nothing to anyone about noticing it. He had made no changes to his routine, no adjustments to his movements, no calls to people he trusted to ask questions, because changing the routine would tell whoever was watching that he had seen them. And the most valuable thing, in those 11 days, was that they believed he had not. What he had done instead, quietly, through channels that moved slowly enough to leave no traceable pattern, was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with guards or guns or the conventional architecture of self-protection. Something that the three men in the basement on 116th Street, staring at their map, had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, because it was the kind of move that only makes sense if you understand, at a level most people never reach, that the most effective thing you can do when three men are planning to bring a wall down on you is to put something inside the wall first. The phone rang at 11 o'clock exactly. Johnson closed his book, marking the page with a folded receipt from the diner on 145th. He reached across to the side table and lifted the receiver on the second ring. He did not speak first. He listened. The silence that came from the other end of the line was not the silence of a dead connection. Dead connections have a particular flatness to them, an absence of texture. This silence had texture. It had breath in it. Slow, controlled, but present. It had the specific weight of someone who had picked up the phone and dialed and was now standing on the other side of indecision, holding a receiver, trying to find the words for something they had rehearsed and could no longer remember how to say. Johnson waited. He was patient in ways that most people were not, because he understood that silence, applied correctly, was more effective than almost any question. 7 seconds passed. Then Johnson spoke. Quietly, without heat, without urgency, in the tone of a man confirming an appointment he had already known about. "Thank you for calling. I already know. Dike." He set the receiver down gently. He did not slam it. He did not hold it for a moment before hanging up, the way people do when they are processing emotion. He simply placed it back in the cradle with the same deliberate care he applied to everything. And then he turned back to the window. Harlem was lit below him. The corner stores, the streetlights on Edgecombe, a bus moving up the avenue, nearly empty at this hour, its windows yellow against the dark, a woman walking fast on the opposite sidewalk, coat pulled tight against the November cold. Ordinary. Ordinary in the specific way that Harlem was always ordinary on the surface, regardless of what was moving underneath it. Johnson looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup still warm, just barely, and took a slow sip. He set it down. He opened his book again, found his page, and began to read. He did not call anyone. He did not move from his chair. He did not check the door or the window or the stairwell. He read 3 more pages of Dostoevsky, finished his coffee, and at 11:17 he set the book aside, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark looking out at the lights of Harlem with the unhurried composure of a man who has already made every decision that needed to be made and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up. 3 blocks away, in the basement on 116th Street, Carlo Messina looked at his watch. 11 o'clock. 1 hour to go. He looked at Doyle, then at Willis, then back at the map. "We go over it one more time," he said. Nobody objected. They went over it one more time. What none of them said, what none of them could bring themselves to say aloud in that room, was the thing that had been present all evening as a low, persistent frequency beneath the planning and the checking and the professional calm. The thing that Messina felt but attributed to pre-operation nerves. The thing that Doyle felt and could not entirely explain. The thing that Willis felt and had learned. Over 20 years of this particular work. To take seriously when it arrived without an obvious source. The feeling that something in the room already knows how this ends. And it is not the plan. Bumpy Johnson did not move from that chair. Did not make a single call. Did not change a single detail of what the 3 men in the basement believed they knew about his evening. Because he had already done everything that needed doing 3 weeks earlier, in a conversation so quiet that no one outside of one other person knew it had taken place. The question was not whether the plan would fail. The question was what exactly Bumpy Johnson had put inside the wall and when it was going to go off. 11:30. The basement on 116th Street had been empty for 20 minutes by then. The map was still on the table. Corners still weighted down by the coffee mug and the ashtray and the 2 empty glasses. But the men who had studied it were gone, each one moving through Harlem's November darkness toward a position they had memorized down to the number of steps between doorways. The single bulb still burned above the empty table. Nobody had thought to turn it off, or perhaps nobody had wanted to be the last one in the room. Messina moved north on Lenox Avenue, alone, hands in the pockets of his gray suit, walking at the pace of a man with no particular destination. This was deliberate. Messina had learned early in his career that the way a man moves through a neighborhood tells that neighborhood everything it needs to know about his intentions. Purposeful movement attracts attention. Casual movement disappears into the background noise of a city at night. He crossed 120th Street without breaking stride, nodded once at a woman sitting on her stoop who looked up as he passed, and continued north with the unhurried patience of someone who has done this kind of work long enough to understand that the last 30 minutes before midnight are not the time for urgency. Urgency is for people who haven't planned carefully enough. 3 blocks east and moving parallel. Ray Doyle was not as composed. He had taken the route they had assigned him east on 117th, then north on 5th Avenue toward the approach that his knowledge of Johnson's building made him uniquely suited to navigate. But his stride had a quality to it that a careful observer might have noticed. Slightly too fast, slightly too deliberate in its regularity. The way a man walks when he is concentrating on appearing normal rather than actually being normal. Doyle's hands were not in his pockets. They were at his sides, fingers slightly open. The unconscious posture of a man who wants to be able to reach for something quickly. He had not been this close to Bumpy Johnson's building in 14 months. The proximity was doing something to his nervous system that all of his preparation had not adequately addressed. And moving west from Amsterdam Avenue, cutting through the side streets with the fluid, unhurried ease of a man who has done this in 9 cities and found each one fundamentally the same after midnight, was Preacher Willis. Willis moved differently from both of them, not carefully, not quickly, but with a quality of attention that was almost meditative, his eyes tracking everything, cataloging everything, filing everything into the particular mental architecture of a man who survives by noticing what other people miss. He had confirmed his secondary weapon at 11:15, reaching down to his left ankle in the shadows of a doorway on Amsterdam and feeling the familiar weight of it with 2 fingers before straightening up and continuing west. He had thought about the photograph again, the one he'd been shown 3 days ago. Messina and Doyle in a room without him, heads together over papers Willis was not meant to see, and then he had set the thought aside. The way he set aside everything that was not immediately actionable. There would be time for that calculation later. The plan came first. Each of them believed, at 11:30, that they were the only one carrying a private contingency into this night. Each of them was wrong. 22 days before that Tuesday night, Bumpy Johnson had a conversation that lasted 45 minutes and took place in a room that no one outside of two people knew existed. The room was in the back of a dry cleaning establishment on 133rd Street, behind a false wall that had been installed in 1958 for reasons that had since become irrelevant but that now served a different purpose, a space where Bumpy Johnson could meet with exactly one person at a time, with the certainty that the conversation would remain between them and whatever God was paying attention that afternoon. The person he met with was a man named Calvin Tate, though nobody in any of the three circles now moving through Harlem streets had ever heard that name. In Johnson's world, he was known only as Cato, a name Johnson had given him years earlier, after the Roman senator who had served as the conscience of a republic, not through power, but through the precise and incorruptible application of truth. Johnson appreciated the parallel. Cato was 40 years old, unremarkable in appearance, and possessed of a quality that Johnson valued above almost any other in the people around him, the ability to be present in a room without being remembered afterward. In 22 years of working in various capacities, within and around Harlem's underground economy, Calvin Tate had never once appeared in a police report, had never been identified by anyone as affiliated with any specific organization, had never been photographed, to his knowledge, in any context that connected him to anything. He was in the most literal and operational sense, invisible not because he hid aggressively, but because he had a gift for occupying exactly the amount of space that people expected to see in a given environment, no more and no less, which meant that afterward their minds smoothed over him the way water smooths over a stone. Johnson had explained the situation to Cato with the economy of language he applied to everything important. 3 parties, 3 separate interests, a convergence that was coming. He did not say how he knew. He never explained that part to anyone, and a window of approximately 3 weeks to introduce something into that convergence that would change its outcome, not through force, not through threat, through information, specifically, through the particular kind of information that each of the 3 parties involved would find most destabilizing, delivered at the precise moment when their confidence was highest and their vigilance was therefore lowest. "I don't need you to do anything," Johnson had said, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, in the tone he used when he was being most precise. "I need you to be in 3 places. I need you to listen, and when the right moment comes, and you will know it when it comes, because it will be the moment when each of them feels most certain about the other 2, I need you to whisper exactly one true thing into exactly one ear, just enough truth to let their own fear do the rest." Cato had asked only one question: what if they don't break? Johnson had looked at him for a moment before answering. "They're already broken," he said. "I'm just showing each of them the cracks in the other 2. Men like that don't need to be pushed. They need to be shown the door." Cato had spent the following 3 weeks doing something that required a quality of patience and social intelligence that very few people possess. He had made himself useful to all 3 parties simultaneously, without any of them knowing he was connected to the others. To Messina's people, he was a local contact with knowledge of Harlem streets and a willingness to provide logistical support without asking inconvenient questions. To Willis, he was a source, someone who moved information for a fee, the kind of peripheral figure that men in Willis's profession cultivate in every city they work in, because information is always more valuable than ammunition. To Ray Doyle, he was something simpler and more dangerous, a familiar face from the neighborhood, someone who had been around long enough to seem trustworthy, who had bought Doyle a drink twice in the past month and listened sympathetically to the particular anxieties of a man who had made a large decision and was no longer entirely certain it was the right one. In each case, Cato had done exactly what Johnson instructed. He listened. He waited. And on the night of November 12, 1963, at the precise moment when each of the 3 men moving through Harlem streets was most certain of the plan and most certain of each other, Calvin Tate delivered exactly one true thing to exactly one ear, Information is not dangerous because it is false. It is dangerous because it is true and because the truth, dropped into the right mind at the right moment, does not need to be elaborated on. The mind does that work itself. The mind takes one true thing and builds an entire architecture of implication around it. And by the time it is finished, the original fact is almost irrelevant. What matters is what the mind constructed in response to it. And the mind, when it is frightened, and when it is given a true thing to be frightened about, builds very fast and very dark. 1147. Preacher Willis was on 118th Street, moving west, when he felt a slight additional weight in the left side pocket of his coat. He stopped walking, stood still for 2 seconds, reached in with 2 fingers and drew out a manila envelope. Small, sealed, folded once. He looked at it without expression. He had not put it there. He was certain he had not put it there. Because Willis was the kind of man who knew at all times exactly what was in each of his pockets, the way a pilot knows the position of every instrument on a panel without looking at it. He stepped into the shadow of a building entrance and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items. The first was a photograph, black and white, slightly grainy, taken through a window or from a significant distance with a long lens. It showed 2 men at a table in a room Willis did not recognize. One of the men was Carlo Messina. The other was Ray Doyle. They were looking at papers on the table between them. The meeting, based on the photograph, had taken place recently. Messina was wearing the same gray suit Willis had seen him in twice this week. And crucially, in this photograph, there were only 2 chairs at the table. There had never been a third. The second item was a single sheet of paper, folded. Willis unfolded it. On it, in neat block printing, were 3 names and 3 addresses. Willis read the first name on the list and felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly, but its functional equivalent. The cold, precise recognition of having miscalculated something important. His name was at the top of the list. Below it was an address in Brooklyn that he had not given to anyone connected with this job. An address where his wife and his 2 children lived in a house he had bought under a name that was not his own. Using money, he had moved through channels that he had spent years making invisible. Beneath the address, in the same block, printing, "Cleanup begins at 1 Witnesses first." Willis stood in the shadow of that doorway for exactly 30 seconds. He was counting. He always counted when he needed to think, because counting gave the mind a rhythm to work against. And rhythm, in his experience, prevented panic. At 30 seconds, he folded the paper, put it in his inside jacket pocket, put the photograph in the same pocket, and buttoned it. Then he took his hand out of his jacket, looked both ways along 118th Street, and changed direction. He was no longer moving toward Edgecombe Avenue. He was moving toward the last confirmed position of Ray Doyle. The geometry of 3 men moving through a neighborhood at night, each unaware of the other's real-time positions, is inherently unstable. Any deviation from the agreed routes creates a cascade position shift. Timing breaks down. The careful architecture of a coordinated plan begins to develop gaps. Willis understood this. He had changed his route anyway, because the alternative was continuing toward a building where, at 1 a.m, a man named Carlo Messina had apparently arranged for the cleanup to begin. Willis was not a man who required extended deliberation on questions of self-preservation. What had been a coordinated approach to a single target was, at 11:47, already something else entirely, though none of the 3 men yet fully understood the shape of what it was becoming. Ray Doyle heard it at 11:51. Not a sound, a sentence. 4 words, spoken quietly from very close behind him as he moved north along the edge of a building on 118th Street, close enough that he felt the breath of it near his left ear before the words registered. "You're first on the list." Doyle spun around. There was a man behind him, ordinary-looking, someone he recognized from the neighborhood, a face he'd seen before without ever attaching significance to it. The man was already moving away, hands in his pockets, walking east without looking back. disappearing into the dark with the practiced ease of someone who had done this particular thing before. Doyle stood still. His heart was doing something complicated. He replayed the 4 words, turning them over, looking for ambiguity in them and finding none. "You're first on the list." There was only one list that was relevant to Doyle's life tonight, and he had not written it, and he had not been told he was on it. He had been told he was one of 3 men in a clean, simple operation with clear roles and a shared outcome. He had been told that after tonight, his future with Messina's organization would be substantially improved. He had been told a number of things by Carlo Messina over the past 3 months, delivered in that flat, professional tone that left no room for negotiation or doubt. He thought now, standing on 118th Street at 11:51 in November, about the particular way Messina looked at him, had always looked at him. Not the contempt Messina showed openly toward Willis. Something more specific, more considered. The expression. Doyle now recognized with the clarity of a man who has just been handed the key to a code he has been reading wrong for months, of a man looking at something he intends to use once and then discard. Doyle reached into his jacket. His hand closed around the grip of the revolver there. He did not draw it. He held it. The way you hold something familiar when everything else has stopped being familiar. And he stood on 118th Street and thought about what his options were and found that most of them had just closed. He was not going to Edgecombe Avenue. He understood that with sudden, complete clarity. He was not finishing the job, because the job, as it had been explained to him, was apparently not the actual job, and the actual job included him in a way that he had not anticipated and could not accept. What Doyle did not yet know was that Willis was somewhere to his west, moving in his direction, for reasons of his own that had arrived at the same conclusion from a different angle. What neither of them knew was that Carlo Messina, moving north on the far side of the same block, had registered the deviation in the plan's timing with the practiced sensitivity of a man who has run enough operations to know when something has gone wrong before he can see the evidence of it. Messina had stopped walking at 11:52. He was standing at the corner of 118th and Lenox, and he was doing the calculation. Doyle's approach should have put him 3 blocks north by now. Willis's sweep of the exterior should have had him stationary at the designated corner position. Neither of those things was producing the signals, the absence of movement, the settled silence that they should have been producing at this stage of the countdown. Something had shifted. Something in the plan's architecture had moved, and Messina did not yet know what it was or where the movement had originated. For the first time that evening, Carlo Messina felt something he would not have described as cold, but which functioned, in his nervous system, in exactly the way cold does a reduction in temperature that began in the center of the chest and moved outward. A sensation that was not fear but was adjacent to it. The sensation of a man who has built something precise and is hearing, for the first time, the sound of a piece of it being wrong. He stood at the corner and ran the logic. If the plan had been compromised from outside, if someone had tipped Johnson, if the approach had been spotted, the response would already be visible. There would be movement from Johnson's building, phone calls, people appearing in the street. There was none of that. Harlem was quiet in the specific way Harlem is quiet after 11 on a Tuesday night in November. The compromise, if there was one, had not come from outside. It had come from inside, which meant that one of the 2 men he was working with had received information they were not supposed to have, and had made a decision based on it, which meant that someone had given them that information, which meant that someone had been inside this plan and who was not supposed to be inside this plan. Messina started moving again, not toward Edgecombe Avenue, toward the alley on 118th Street where the 3 approach routes, by the geometry of the plan he had designed himself, inevitably converged. 11:59. The alley behind the building on 118th Street was not a place that appeared on any map of Harlem with any particular designation. It was simply the space between 2 buildings, 12 feet wide, running half a block between 118th and 119th, used during the day for deliveries and during the night for nothing in particular. It had a single lamp at the far end that provided enough light to see shapes but not enough to read faces. 3 men walked into that alley from 3 different directions within 45 seconds of each other. Willis came in from the West End and stopped 6 feet inside. Doyle came in from the East End and stopped when he saw Willis. Messina came in from the 118th Street entrance and stopped when he saw both of them. And the three men stood in the near darkness of a Harlem alley at 11:59 on a Tuesday night in November and looked at each other. Nobody spoke first. The silence that settled over the alley in those first few seconds was different in quality from any of the silences that had preceded it that evening. It was not the silence of planning. It was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of three men who have each arrived, from different directions and by different routes, at the same understanding that the night has become something none of them planned for, and that the person responsible for that transformation is not present, has never been present, and has nonetheless been in the room with all of them from the beginning. Willis was the one who spoke. His voice was level, almost conversational, which was the most frightening thing about it. "You want to tell me about the list," he said, "or should we start somewhere else?" Messina looked at him, then at Doyle. Doyle's hand was inside his jacket. Willis's hands were visible, which told Messina something about where Willis's secondary weapon was and why his hands did not need to be hidden. Messina's own hands were in the pockets of his gray suit, and he left them there, because the calculation he was running rapidly, in the precise way he ran calculations, was telling him that this was not a situation that would be improved by anyone drawing anything in the next 30 seconds. "There is no list," Messina said. His voice was even, professional, the voice of a man managing a situation. "Wrong answer," Willis said, not loudly, not with heat. Just as a statement of fact. Doyle said nothing. He was looking at Messina the way a man looks at someone he has been reading wrong for a long time and has just now corrected his interpretation of, and the expression on his face was not anger exactly. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. The expression of a decision already made. The three men stood there, and Harlem was quiet around them. And somewhere above the roofline the November sky was perfectly clear. And in an apartment 3 blocks away, a lamp was burning in a 4th-floor window where a man sat in a wooden chair with a closed book in his lap and the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for a silence that he already knows is coming. Bumpy Johnson was not in that alley. He had never been in any danger of being in that alley. Everything that was happening in that 12 feet of darkness between 2 Harlem buildings at 11:59 on Tuesday, November 12th, 1963 was happening because of decisions he had made 22 days earlier in a room behind a false wall on 133rd Street, decisions that required nothing further from him. No presence, no intervention, no risk. He had built the outcome and then stepped back and let the architecture of other people's fear and self-interest do what architecture does when it is correctly designed, hold its shape under pressure until the pressure comes from inside, and then come apart precisely where he had always known it would. The clock in the window of the building at the alley's east end ticked forward to midnight, and 3 men who had come to Harlem to end one life stood in the dark, guns in hand or within reach, and looked at each other, and understood each in his own way, each arriving at it from the particular angle of his own betrayal that the trap they were standing in had not been built tonight. It had been built 3 weeks ago, by someone who was not here, who had never needed to be here, and who was at this exact moment 3 blocks away in a lit apartment, reading Dostoevsky. The next morning, only one of the 3 men who had walked into that alley was in any condition to walk out of Harlem under his own power, and what he did next, where he went, and why, and what he said when he got there was the part of the story that nobody who heard it afterward could fully explain, because he didn't run. He didn't disappear. He walked 12 blocks north in the early morning light and knocked on the door of the man he had come to destroy, and the door was already open. 6:47 in the morning. Harlem woke up the way Harlem always woke up, without ceremony, without pause, without any acknowledgement that the night before had been anything other than an ordinary November night. The newsstand on the corner of 145th and Lenox opened at 6:30. And by 6:47 the man behind it was already calling out headlines to people passing on their way to work. His breath visible in the cold morning air, his voice carrying the particular rhythm of a man who has done this same thing at this same corner for 11 years and expects to do it for 11 more. A school bus idled on 143rd Street, its yellow sides catching the early light. The diner on 145th had its door propped open despite the cold, and the smell of coffee and fried eggs moved out into the street and mixed with the smell of bus exhaust and cold concrete in the specific combination that was, for anyone who had grown up here, the smell of Harlem in the morning. Nobody on those streets knew what had happened in the alley on 118th Street between 11:59 and midnight. Nobody was talking about it. Nobody had any reason to connect the ordinary Tuesday morning unfolding around them to anything extraordinary. The only evidence that anything had occurred at all was on page 12 of the morning paper, a single paragraph. 4 sentences, tucked between an advertisement for a hardware store and a brief item about a water main repair on Amsterdam Avenue. Disturbance reported in alley near West 118th Street. Officers responding found evidence of altercation. Investigation ongoing. No arrests made. No names. No description of what had been found or by whom. 4 sentences that told the reader almost nothing, which was, in the particular grammar of New York City newspaper reporting in 1963, a way of saying that whatever had happened was either too complicated or too sensitive to explain in 4 sentences, and that the people responsible for explaining it had decided, for the time being, not to try. The paper had been folded to that page and left on a specific table in a specific apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, where a man had been sitting since 5:30 in the morning with a fresh cup of coffee, and the unhurried stillness of someone who slept well and woke early and had no unfinished business pressing on his mind. Ray Doyle knocked on the door of Bumpy Johnson's apartment at 7 o'clock exactly. The knock was not tentative, but it was not confident either. It was the knock of a man who has made a decision he is no longer questioning, but has not yet fully inhabited the sound of someone who knows what he is doing, without entirely knowing why, following a logic that his mind has accepted, even though the rest of him is not caught up. The door was open, not unlocked open, pushed to, but not latched, so that Doyle's knock swung it inward 2 inches, and he was left standing in the hallway, looking through the gap at Bumpy Johnson sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folded newspaper, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing the night before, looking like a man who had simply never gone to bed because sleep had not been necessary. Johnson did not look up when the door swung open. He reached across the table, lifted a second cup that had been sitting there already filled, and pushed it to the edge of the table nearest the door. "Sit down," he said. Doyle came in. He sat down across from Johnson. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Not because he was cold, but because having something to hold made the next part slightly more possible. The apartment was quiet in the way that apartments are quiet at 7 in the morning, when the city outside is already loud, a contained silence, a pocket of stillness inside the larger noise of Harlem coming back to life. The silence between them lasted almost a full minute. Johnson drank his coffee. Doyle looked at the table. Neither of them was in a hurry, or rather Johnson was not in a hurry, which meant the pace of the room was his. And Doyle, who had spent 6 years learning how rooms worked when Bumpy Johnson was in them, understood this without needing it explained. Finally, Doyle looked up. His face had the particular quality of a man who has been awake all night processing something that kept refusing to resolve, and has arrived at morning with the question still intact, unchanged, demanding an answer that nothing in his experience has equipped him to find on his own. "How long did you know?" he said. Johnson set his cup down. He looked at Doyle for a moment, not the evaluating look of a man deciding whether to trust, but the slower, quieter look of a man deciding where to begin. Then he leaned back in his chair and told a story. He said that when he was 17 years old, a man named Walter Briggs had taught him to play chess in the back room of a barber shop on 132nd Street. Briggs was 60 at the time, had been playing chess since he was 8, and had the particular quality of patience that very old chess players develop the ability to sit with a position for a long time without needing it to resolve. Johnson had played against him every Saturday for 4 months and had lost every single game. Not narrowly, completely. The kind of losses that feel less like defeats and more like demonstrations, like the other person is showing you something about the nature of the game that you have not yet understood. On the last Saturday of the 4th month, Johnson had lost a game in 11 moves, which was, even by his standards at that point, unusually fast. He had stared at the board afterward for a long time. Then he had said, to no one in particular, that he had made a mistake on move 7, and that was why he lost. Briggs had shaken his head. "You didn't lose because of move 7, he said. "You lost because you spent the whole game trying to figure out how to win. You never stopped to figure out what I wanted more than winning. If you'd understood that, you'd have seen move 4 coming. You'd have seen all of it coming." Johnson paused. He looked at Doyle across the kitchen table. "Messina wanted Harlem," he said. "Willis wanted money. You wanted a future you thought I couldn't give you." He picked up his coffee cup, turned it once in his hands. "But what each of you wanted more than any of that, more than Harlem, more than money, more than a future, was to believe that the person next to you wasn't going to take it away from you first." He set the cup down. "I didn't break your alliance. You were never an alliance. I just made sure each of you could see what the other two were holding." Doyle sat with that. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the school bus on 143rd Street pulled away from the curb, and the sound of it carried faintly through the window, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to everything that had happened in the 12 hours preceding it. "You never needed to be there," Doyle said. It was not quite a question. "I was there," Johnson said simply. "I just wasn't in the alley." At 7:22, Bumpy Johnson stood up from the table, put on his coat, picked up the folded newspaper, and walked out of the apartment. Doyle stayed at the table. He did not try to follow. He sat with his coffee cup in the silence of the kitchen and the slow, thorough understanding that was still settling into him, like water finding its level. And he listened to Johnson's footsteps move down the hallway and down the stairs and out into the morning. On the street below, Harlem was fully awake. Johnson walked to the newsstand on the corner, bought a paper, a second copy, though the man behind the counter did not know that, and opened it to page 12. He read the 4 sentences there. He folded the paper, tucked it under his arm, and walked north on Edgecombe Avenue in the November morning light, at the pace of a man with no particular destination and no particular urgency. Nodding once to a woman he recognized outside the diner, and pausing briefly to look up at the sky above the roofline, clear, pale blue, the kind of sky that appears sometimes in November like a concession, like the weather acknowledging that it owes the city one last decent morning before winter arrives in earnest. He did not look back toward his building. He did not make any calls. He did not speak to anyone about what had happened the night before, or what had not happened, which amounted to the same thing. 3 men had come to Harlem the previous night carrying the specific intention of ending Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's life. They had planned for weeks. They had studied him, mapped him, timed him, and built an architecture of approach that accounted for every variable they could identify. And they had failed not because Johnson outran them, not because he outgunned them, not because anyone intervened on his behalf in any visible or dramatic way. They had failed because Johnson had understood, with the depth and patience of a man who has spent a lifetime reading people more carefully than they read themselves, exactly what each of them feared losing more than they wanted to win. And he had used that understanding the way Briggs had used move 4 against a 17-year-old boy who was too busy trying to win to notice what was actually happening on the board. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the most weapons. It is not the one with the most allies, or the most money, or the most history of violence behind them. It is the one who understood the room before anyone else walked into it, who knew what each person there wanted and feared, and would ultimately choose when those two things came into conflict. That person does not need to be present when the conflict arrives. They have already been there. They were there 3 weeks ago, in a quiet room behind a false wall on 133rd Street, drinking coffee and explaining to one man exactly what to whisper and when. Bumpy Johnson turned the corner at 148th Street and walked on. Behind him, Harlem continued its morning without interruption. the newsstand, the school bus, the smell of coffee from the diner on 145th, the city, indifferent and continuous, moving forward the way it always does, as though last night were simply last night, and this morning were simply this morning, and the distance between a man's survival and his destruction were not, in the end, a matter of guns or allies or timing, but of something quieter and far more difficult to acquire, the understanding of what the other person wants more than they want to win. That was November 1963. Bumpy Johnson would live for another 5 years, moving through Harlem with the same unhurried composure, the same morning newspaper, the same cup of coffee at the same diner table. In all of those years, no one tried again. Not because they stopped wanting to, because they remembered what happened to the last 3 men who did, and more importantly, because they understood, at last, that trying to outmaneuver Bumpy Johnson required understanding him first. And understanding him, as it turned out, was the one thing nobody who came against him ever managed to do before he had already understood them.